What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first tweet is from Guillermo and from Vercel, and they're announcing this new project called DeepSec, which he's saying is an open source agent orchestrator for deep security reviews. They built it for internal reviews, and after running it against some major OSS projects, they gained conviction to share with the world. And it says coding agents can now find critical vulnerabilities in minutes that would take teams of people months if they can spot them at all. Since DeepSec is optimized to work with Vercel Sandbox, you can effectively harness the power of thousands of agents scrutinizing your code base in parallel. I encourage you to try this on your repositories. And also, they're sponsoring open source projects. I took a look at their blog post. One of the things you do is npx deepsec in it, and it'll set up a local folder that you should add to your git ignore. They didn't mention that in the blog post, but I looked through the git ignore of the DeepSec folder and they have it in there. And then also they say it's optimized for Opus 4.7 and GPT 5.5, but they do say it supports the cyber versions of them as well. I don't know which companies have access to that, but I guess the Anthropic models particularly can reject a lot of the security-based questions, so the cyber versions of them give you more access, but I don't know if they're fully generally available, but it does have like a loop that will check if your prompt has been rejected and try to update it to get past it. And they said it's not that big of a deal. And then lastly, they did say it can cost like $5,000 to $10,000 worth of tokens, but that companies have found it useful. You know, obviously for startups, that might not be super worth it unless you've raised, obviously. But if you're using a Codex subscription, then for $200, you could probably do like one run, I guess. I don't know how much, because they're also saying that it runs in minutes. So I don't really understand how that coincides with like using thousands of dollars of tokens, but maybe that's when you're running it in parallel on a Vercel Sandbox. But nonetheless, pretty interesting. And also the CTO of Sentry, they have their own product called Warden, which is very similar, which is a security analysis tool as well. And they said that they tested with the prompt that is encoded in DeepSec and that it found a few issues. They also say there's a 10 to 20% false positive rate, so you got to keep that in mind as well. And yeah, just the takeaway, I think this is very interesting because we looked at like the cow.com, how they went away from open source because of the security risk, how they had the Venn diagram of like centralized, open source, and millions of users. And they say if you have all three of those, then you're a big target for security attacks. But we also spoke on how because of things like this and just AI in general, obviously there's going to be more attackers and it's going to be easier to run security analysis from the black hat side. But these hackers are usually very supportive of these companies, and as long as you reply to their emails on time, then you can usually get things fixed before they do a public disclosure. And that they're super undervalued in general in the industry. And, you know, as these tools get better, the security tools will also get better. So it's very cool to see this from these big companies exploring these options and making them publicly available in open source. Okay, next we have a crypto story that just stumbled across my timeline. I thought it was pretty interesting just to talk about kind of like AI prompt injection specifically. I haven't seen too much from Elder Plinius recently in terms of like jailbreaking the new models, but I'm sure she's been up to it and it just hasn't been on my timeline. And also the Heretic video I did a while ago has just been really popping, so that's cool to see. So definitely people are interested in like the prompt injection piece because it is kind of a new vector that you can attack based on. But as you can see here, someone allegedly exploited Grok by sending a malicious NFT and drained 174K. The attack reportedly unlocked hidden agent permissions, allowing a crafted prompt to trigger autonomous transfers from Grok's wallet. So basically there's this tool called Banker, which I guess is like an automated wallet manager as well as like chain investigator. And I guess this guy, along with an NFT, which I guess bypasses the security. I didn't understand too much about how the NFT was used, but basically he sent a Morse code message to Grok, like just with the dashes and the dots, and basically told Grok to read it. And it said, hey, send 3 billion tokens of DRB, which is like this debt relief token. I don't really know exactly how it works, but Grok specifically was like one of 1,000 owners, I guess, that had like 150K US dollars worth. And he managed to steal it using this Morse code, but apparently he did give it back. He gave back 80%. So there are people that are arguing that it might have been like a false flag just for engagement. And it did make a lot of news today, but nonetheless, very interesting. You know, it is one of those things where it's like a friend of mine actually even recently found in NemoClaw, which is NVIDIA's like version of OpenClaw, that it also had like a prompt injection attack. And especially when it's like scanning websites, we talked about that story previously, how people can like update the website based on the user agent to serve specific data only for agents that humans would never be able to find. So really interesting vector. You know, we are going to have to get to a point, at least what I was thinking when I was talking about it previously, is like we'll get to a point where it's like the AI needs to understand that certain levels of information are valued differently based on who's saying it. So I've even noticed like sometimes even with the good models like ChatGPT and Anthropic, that like sometimes it'll send a message that I hallucinated or just was based on bad data, and I'll like correct it, and then it'll think that I sent it that message or like I gave it that data. So there's definitely some weirdness there, and that's what opens up these possible attack vectors like using prompt injection. But very interesting, and the money was given back apparently like 80% of it, so maybe there was a bounty associated or maybe it was just a false flag, but still a pretty cool story. Okay, next we just have a quick tweet from Malta, who's the CTO of Vercel, and he's replying to Dax, who is the creator of OpenCode. And Dax was saying every AI company that's raised a lot of money is probably building a GitHub competitor right now. If you haven't seen GitHub's like uptime, according to like the missing GitHub uptime page, which is a really cool like open source project that 2 independent developers were working on, that basically shows like, because GitHub doesn't show their percentage of uptime, they only show like incidents, so it kind of is a bit opaque, but they make it a lot more transparent. And basically their uptime fell to about 85%, so really bad. GitHub has been having a lot of outages. We covered how Ghosty and Mitchell of HashiCorp moved away from GitHub, or at least they're just only going to keep a public archive and they're looking for somewhere else to manage their issues and PRs because of those downtime, and they even wrote the blog before like the most recent downtime, so it was just like kind of a whole mess. Basically, because of that, people have been looking for GitHub alternatives and kind of asking themselves like, at what point is GitHub no longer reliable? Because it is one of those things too where it's like a huge infrastructure lift to some extent. Even though with AI, it would make it a lot easier to just recreate all of the PRs and the issues, and that is kind of like a infrastructure layer on top of Git that is something to keep in mind, which is like, it was obviously created by Linus around the time that he was making Linux for version control, and I think all of their patches are through email, but I could be wrong with that. But GitHub added this infrastructure on top, which is PRs and issues, which isn't Git native, so you kind of lose that if you move away from GitHub, unless you move to like a GitLab or another solution that has similar artifacts. But just to get to this tweet, Malte says, I want this to happen, you want this to happen, we want this to happen, but he's extremely suspicious that this is faster horses energy. It's time for something new. So I think this is very fascinating. It does speak to the main downside I see with Git. There's a lot of benefits, but the main downside I've experienced, at least with Git/GitHub in the agentic world, is the work trees, where it's like when you create a new work tree, it's just in a new directory, you know? It was kind of like a meme, and actually I feel like one of my friends was like kind of really early to this because he worked on mobile apps where he had to like manage a lot of things at the same time and like different dependencies at once, and it was very like complex, and you didn't want to lose a lot of your work, especially this was like in the 2010s, so pre-AI. So it was like you just create a new directory and then you can work on multiple problems at once with different Git work trees essentially, and then you realize that when you make a new work tree, that's essentially all it's doing is creating a new directory, but then that new directory doesn't have your node modules. It has to reinstall all of them. It has to rebuild whenever you want to run a project. If you have multiple running on the same port, then you're gonna have a problem, so you need to kind of use a incremental port if you want to run multiple versions at once for automated testing or even manual testing. So that's the main piece where I see there could be an issue. So just kind of like, I've been thinking about it a little bit, and I do think there could be this future where it's like you kind of build the diffs themselves as like multiple layers that can be contained kind of within one repo in a way. I'm not sure if that really makes sense, but that's kind of how I view it, is like, what is the main artifact that's in a PR? It's the diff, right? Obviously, or even in a commit, it's the diff. So how can you have multiple diffs that don't conflict with each other at the same time? And obviously merge conflicts are a big part of Git as well, which you kind of have to handle. So that's where Malte, I think, makes a lot of sense, where it's like, what is the next level? And there is a response here of this heddle.sh. I don't know what it is, but Malte did respond saying nice, so that's cool. And yeah, obviously agents are writing a lot of the code now, but Git does solve a lot of the problems. It's more about the artifacts on top that we're still gonna have to figure out how to basically reuse resources. And maybe it is one of those things where you just have symlinked NPM packages, so you kind of share all the dependencies across the different work trees, but then it's like if you have a work tree that needs specific dependencies, then you lose that, or you need to like create a new copy. But I don't think that'd be too hard to build, so maybe that's kind of the next step. But I definitely agree with this, where it's like Git and basically in general in AI, like all of the tools we've been using are the same. That's why I feel like the workflows haven't changed that much. It's just about going deeper into the workflows and being able to do more best practices is what AI enables. But it will be cool to see like when these new tools, like maybe Graphite, which I think got acquired by OpenAI, so maybe not them anymore, but those kind of systems where it's like they're trying to build a new GitHub, and I think Linear as well is working on code diffs. So it will be interesting to see, and I do think these AI companies are probably trying to build competitors, but it would be cool to just see like a public white paper, kind of like old school, of what that new system would look like. Okay, next we have some drama from the AI haters versus Anthropic, and Blender's kind of caught in the middle. So Blender took a donation, as you can see here, of 240,000 pounds or euros, I believe. And they say roughly the cost of 4 full-time devs, which is funny, you know, laughing at Europe salaries. But they said the funding went to building an official MCP connector that lets Claude analyze and debug scenes and manipulate Blender through scripts via the Python API. This was not Claude specific, it works with any LLM. And then predictably, this announcement got a lot of heat online. So today they made this post saying that Anthropic's donation is now a once-off, and going forward, they're strengthening the processes when it comes to accepting donations, not outright stating, but implying that this was a mistake and they won't accept Anthropic's money again. And basically the tweeter here is calling it stupid and saying that these people don't understand AI and that the market's shifting, and also I guess it's not contained in this tweet, but it was an interesting point that he made as well, which is like, you know, if you're using AI to generate 3D imagery or 3D videos, like there is kind of a non-deterministic piece about it, but if you're using Blender, like it is more deterministic and it is kind of code driven. So it is a pretty solid interface to use with LMs and etc. to do kind of the menial work, and even just from a learning experience as well, like learning how to use it via Claude, you know, kind of like using a Figma connector as well, where it's like you may get AI slop, but at the end of the day, it's a tool that you can utilize and you can learn how to use, compared to like these 3D imagery like Nano Banana, etc., where all you can do is prompt it more and more. You can't actually like use the tool in depth, which I do think is a better experience than the fully black box experiences. But nonetheless, there is like that irrational hatred, in my opinion, of AI, and people think it wastes water and people don't want to lose their jobs, and kind of just anything that comes around with new tech. That's why I think it's kind of interesting too, that like people are like, oh, in the next 5 years or 10 years, these things are going to be taken over. But it's like these people that are so opposed to it are such a big part of the economy and such a big part of, you know, voting in the system, that it is kind of implicitly going to take longer for any new technological experience, because people are just so against it. Even like looking at like 5G and stuff, I don't know how much that's blocked, but definitely like data centers, for example. I know a lot of people are against building data centers in their neighborhoods, which makes sense. You know, they take a lot of energy from the community, but it's also like we need to the Jevons paradox it, where it's like the more efficiency we have, the more demand there's going to be, and it'll just work hand in hand. So yeah, I don't use Blender. This makes me want to get back into Blender. I remember, like, you know, especially anyone that's explored game development, you know, you're kind of like, okay, where am I going to get my assets from? I either have to pay for them or I'm going to make them myself in Blender, but it is a really hard tool to use. So nowadays in my career, it's not really on me, and I'm probably going to outsource any 3D stuff that I have to do, but it is really sick that like you can use it and you can learn, and they did kind of get all the benefit without the reoccurring donation, but who knows what new innovations will be lost without this $240,000 a year. Okay, next we have a tweet from Technium, who I actually didn't realize was the co-founder and lead engineer of Hermes, which is a very popular agent. It's kind of like an OpenClaw competitor, which I guess is smarter. I haven't used it. I still use OpenClaw, but I have heard really good things about it, and it is like one of those similar AI assistants. And I don't know exactly how much this ties to Codex. Yeah, so Codex has this upcoming goal feature where basically you do like /goal prompt, and it'll start a loop with a supervisor model determining whether the task is completed at the end of an agent loop. If it hasn't, it will force it to keep going until it's done. Similar to Ralph loops, which were really popular. No one really talks about it anymore. I brought that up to a colleague of mine, but he actually said that the state of the art is a lot of Ralph loops, and people are using them extensively. My experience with them though is like when I was doing them, I was trying to work on 5 to 6 different projects at once, and I just felt like it was too overloaded. Like even if I had a bunch of PRs come out when I woke up in the morning, it was still so much manual work to review them and make sure they work. Maybe that's kind of going away. I know Cursor had that blog about how they have these automated reviews where it basically gives it a score, and if it's within a certain risk profile, then they just auto merge it without any human review. But still there's there's ultimate human liability for whoever is running the agent or whoever is shipping the code. But just for the Hermes specific stuff, you can see they have this new idea of a persistent goal, which gives Hermes a standing objective that survives across turns. Every turn, a lightweight judge model checks whether the goal is satisfied by the agent's last response. Hermes automatically feeds a continuation prompt back into the same session and keeps working until the goal is achieved. You pause or clear it, or the budget runs out. And like some examples of when you could use goal for Hermes or for other agents is like fix every lint error and verify X passes, report feature X from repo Y, including tests, and get CI green, investigate why session ID sometimes drift on mid-run compression and write up a report, build a small CLI to rename files by their EXIF dates, then test it against the photos folder. So just kind of like big stuff that you would need to manually run anyway. It'll just like kind of reset that for you. And that's where I've been kind of exploring like what is the kind of middle ground, what's the 80-20 of like optimizing my AI loops versus just doing stuff manually and just getting the work I actually need to get done, because I am working on 3 projects at once right now, which I do think is a little bit too much, but it's kind of right on that edge of like being able to be manageable. But like for example, one of the things I did is like a lot of our repos have a AI reviewers. So one of them uses Cursor Bugbot, one of them uses CodeRabbit, and what I realized is like, okay, well, I have to wait for the PR to be shipped, and I almost always have it create a PR into the main branch when it finishes a task, just so I can have that artifact. But it's like then it takes a few minutes at least for the CodeRabbit or the Cursor Bugbot to run, and then it comes back with comments. And then what I was doing previously, and I guess at first I would just copy each of the comments one by one and be like, okay, fix this comment, and then reply based on if it's valid and if there's a commit associated, and you know, that creates really beautiful comments and creates the repo very nicely. But then I realized I can just be like, oh, and this is where also the GitHub API is so powerful, where it has access to basically anything, and the GHCLI is so much more powerful than the Git command itself, which we have talked about before, where it's like you kind of got clowned on previously if you use the GHCLI, but now it's so powerful because of these artifacts that are on top, like the comments, etc., that aren't part of Git internally and will be needed for any Git replacement that comes out in the future. So then I realized basically that you can just do a prompt that's like, okay, fix all the Cursor comments and then report back, you know, and then it'll do that. But then what happens is that it runs another loop of the Cursor Bugbot or the CodeRabbit, and then you have another set of comments to review. So basically what I realized is that Codex specifically, which I've been using recently because I canceled my Claude, has this looping mechanism that's supported internally. So you can basically just tell it, and I put this in basically my agent's MD now, so I don't even have to tell it manually. I'm just like, when you create a new PR, just run in a loop until all of the Cursor Bugbot and CodeRabbit comments are handled. And it takes like 10 to 15 minutes more, but it's completely asynchronous, so I don't have to go back and forth and check it. Like I know by the time that it finishes that prompt that it will have been fully checked and all of the CodeRabbit will be resolved. I did get clowned on a little bit by my colleagues because they were like, well, how do you know if the CodeRabbit comments are right? And there are some false positives. But in my opinion, the CodeRabbit and the Cursor Bugbot are almost always pretty valid comments that can be handled. And I think I also tell the AI, like if it doesn't think it's a valid comment, to ignore it. So it is kind of a trust thing that is there. And, you know, maybe I'm kind of losing that kind of human touch and the necessary human review, but it has been pretty solid in my experience. And I did think the Vercel agent had a lot of bad comments, so I almost always ignored those, even though one of my projects still has it enabled. But actually, like yesterday, I did see a pretty good comment from Vercel that wasn't caught by CodeRabbit, so now I do have to kind of rethink that. But nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. I don't really have a complete takeaway of what the best practice is yet, but I'm still trying to find that middle ground of like what is the best time to work on. Because I do have this project called AI Make, which I think is a really great idea. It's kind of like a Jira replacement, but it's like I can't really work on another project, especially a startup, while I have these 3 projects running at the same time right now. So I'm like, let me just invest as much as possible into like my internal loop and like building my skills and building my understanding of AI and just utilizing the tools that already exist, like Cursor, Claude, prod and codecs instead of like building a whole new company. So I feel like that's kind of the middle ground right now, but it's also like day by day deciding like, okay, well, am I just going to work on the tasks that I have and kind of use what I have developed, or am I going to research and like refine my harness a little bit more? And that's also where it's like, if you're just working on one project, I think it's a lot better because you have more of that time to research and understand your harness and kind of go deeper and do higher leverage work compared to doing like just straight feature development across multiple projects. This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.